Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Steven Pinker, an experimental cognitive scientist and professor of psychology at Harvard. He has been named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world today. He's the author of many books and the winner of many prizes. And he's here today with his new book, which is called Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters. And it is billed as a user's guide to rationality during an epidemic of unreason. Steven, welcome.
Thank you.
Are we in an epidemic of unreason?
We've always been in an epidemic of unreason, although we all apply rationality to our everyday lives. That's how we hold a job. That's how we keep food in the refrigerator and get the kids off to school. But when it comes to larger issues like how is the world being run, what is the origin of misfortune and fortune, we tend to comfort ourselves with uplifting myths rather than seeking evidence for our beliefs.
The book is an argument for why we should learn the tools of rationality and perhaps govern ourselves according to them. I mean, do you feel is that because you feel reason is slipping away from the way that we're living?
It's always been fragile. It's always been tenuous. But we have developed tools of rationality that augment the cognitive capabilities we were born with, tools like logic and probability and statistical decision theory that I think every educated, literate person should command. They make us smarter.
So let's define our terms. What is rationality for you?
I define it as the use of knowledge to attain a goal. Rationality is more or less a synonym of reason. The dictionaries tend to define each one in terms of the other, and they both come from the same Latin root. Logic is one of the tools of reason, but it is not the same as reason. And the reason is that logic helps us attain the goal of deducing true propositions from other true propositions. But a lot of knowledge has to consist of weighing many probabilistic considerations, each one of which tugs your confidence up or down a bit. That's not the same as logic, which is, given the premises, the conclusion must be true. All women are mortals. Xanthippe is a woman, therefore Xanthippe is mortal. That is a useful thing to be able to do, but it's not the entirety of rationality.
So can something be logical but not rational?
It can, because logic requires that you ignore everything you know other than what is stated in the premises. A useful thing to be able to do, that's how we design computers. They are logic machines. But often we do want to apply everything we know. Just to give an example, if I take the syllogism, all plant products are healthy. Tobacco is a plant product, therefore tobacco is healthy. Now that is a valid syllogism. It doesn't happen to be true because one of the premises is a bit dubious, but we would have to bring in our knowledge of how the world works, of the exceptions to a generalization, in order to evaluate the truth of that proposition in the world. In logic, you've got to forget everything you know except what was stated in the premises.
So for rationalism to be useful, do we have to agree on our values, our goals, or does rationality exist on its own?
I think rationality exists on its own. It is in service of a goal, so you can use rational means to attain a goal that we would not agree is a rational goal. For example, the goal of gaining power, the goal of showing off how smart you are, or how noble you are, or how smart or noble your team, your side, your party, your coalition is. In fact, a lot of rationality is deployed to that goal, which is why we have so much politically motivated belief. It can be narrowly rational within your community, say, to deny human-made climate change, if that's what gains you prestige within your social clique, to deny the efficacy of vaccines if you're in a community that's hostile to vaccines. By the lights of our best science, these are irrational if the goal is our best understanding of objective reality. But if the goal is to be a hero within your team, your side, it is rational in the pursuit of that goal.
So in that case, is it helpful for us to think of rationality as something we should all seek to attain?
It is,
given that we've all got different goals.
It is in that we can in turn interrogate our goals and say, well, do you really want to advance an idea that might just be popular in your group but is false? And for some people,
that is irrational, in other words.
It is in the larger scheme of things. It would be very hard for someone to say, yes, this is false, but I believe it anyway. Most people are a little squeamish about making that concession. And so if you can get them to a place in which they realize that that's what they're committed to, at least some people will back off. Now, there are some people who their ego is so invested in their beliefs, whether it's their own wisdom and the morality of their tribe, that they'll go to their grave believing false things, that they just can't be budged. But there are always people who are less viscerally committed, who are more on the fringe of degree of belief, who can be peeled off by rational argument. If you say, well, is that something that the evidence really supports, or is it just a popular idea in your social clique?
What you do in the book is you go through some of these different things, like beginning with logic, but you show how easy it is to make mistakes. I mean, just explain the one that you begin with.
Yes, because these tools of rationality had to be invented precisely because we don't intuitively wield them, at least not across the board. Most of them have their core in some intuition that we do share. We all have a sense of probability that some things probably will happen, but not necessarily. We all have a sense of logic, but what we don't have is a formula that we can use for any subject matter, no matter how unfamiliar. So one of the examples I begin the book with is a classic problem from cognitive psychology called the selection task. Imagine you have a deck of cards where there's a letter on one side and a number on the other. And I ask you to test whether the following rule is in effect. If there's a D on one side, there's a 3 on the other. And I lay out 4 cards, a D, a 3, an F, and a 7. And I say, what are the fewest cards you have to turn over to test whether the rule, if D, then 3 is satisfied, is being obeyed? The vast majority of people say, well, you got to turn over the D, or you have to turn over the D and the 3. Now, the correct answer is you have to turn over the D and the 7. Why? Well, think about it. Of course, you have to turn over the D. If you turn it over and there's no 3, the rule's false. You don't have to turn over the 3 because the rule says if D, then 3, not if 3, then D. The idea that you have to turn over the 3 is the classic fallacy of affirming the consequent, confusing P implies Q with Q implies P. But you do have to turn over the 7, because if you did turn it over and there was a D on the other side, that would falsify the rule if D, then 3. Most people don't get it, although when it's explained to them, they slap themselves on the forehead and they say, oh, yes, of course, why didn't I think of that? That's a classic example of how people don't deploy strictly logical rules, at least with any subject matter. But there are interesting twists, such as, imagine that you are a bouncer in a bar and you're enforcing the rule, if someone is consuming alcohol, they must be over 21. And you have 4 people. You've got someone who is drinking beer, someone who's drinking Coke, someone who's clearly under 21, someone who's clearly over 21. Do you have to ask for the ID of the person drinking beer, of the person drinking Coke? Do you have to look inside the cup to see what the under 21 is drinking, the over 21 is drinking? Now, everyone turns into a logician. Everyone says, well, you've got to card the person drinking beer, and you've got to check to see what the person under 21 is drinking. Now, that is logically identical to if D, then 3, and people get the equivalent of the D and the 7 card. So content matters. And it shows that people are not illogical across the board, but a lot of our logic is baked together with subject matter knowledge. In this case, it is a social contract, a social rule. If you have a privilege, you must meet a requirement. And when it's couched in those terms, then the logic is intuitive. And what the tools of logic that I try to explain in the middle chapters of the book are for is so that we can abstract it away from areas in which we're familiar and have a formula that we can apply to new things that might be totally unfamiliar to us.
And as you say, you do this with all the different tools, whether it's probability or other things. But I mean, just looking through it, I felt, so, well, isn't the problem here that a lot of people are just going to say, I can't get this? You know, and it takes you back to school where some people just go, I don't understand this, I can't do it, I'm never going to get it, so I'm going to drop physics or whatever it might be.
I hope not. And I wrote the book for them. I think they can be presented and ought to be presented in school in a way that they can be mastered. A lot of them take a little kernel of common sense and generalize it as a tool that you can apply anywhere. As in the logic case, where you may not know the fallacy of affirming the consequent or the law of contraposition when stated in those terms, but you do have an intuitive sense which you apply, say, in the bar bouncer case.
But take a debate like climate change, and you raise this in the book as well. You know, we're right now in the middle of a massive debate all over the world about how we should change our own behavior. And people are quite understandably saying, well, why should I spend thousands of pounds converting my house or switching to an electric car, or why should I always get the bus instead of driving when China's building coal-fired power stations? Is it rational to try and take the steps to solve climate change?
Well, indeed, and that is a conundrum, a puzzle, a paradox for which one of the tools of rationality is applicable and explains what's going on, namely game theory, which is what is the rational thing to do when the outcome depends on someone else who's trying to figure out what's the rational thing to do? Often the answers surprise us because the rules of the game are different when you're not dealing with the inanimate world, but we're dealing with another rational agent. And in the case of climate change, indeed, I undergo a sacrifice, I wait for the bus, but if everyone else is driving their SUVs, then I'm kind of the sucker. I'm not preventing climate change, but I am suffering the consequences. The problem being, if everyone thinks that, then everyone is worse off. And we know from game theory that can happen. If every individual focuses on his or her self-interest, everyone acts against their self-interest simultaneously. But then in turn, there are ways out of it. Namely, how do you change the rules of the game so that what each individual decides does work to their collective advantage? Such as, and that's one of the arguments for carbon pricing. Namely, if it is more expensive to drive a big inefficient car as opposed to, say, an electric vehicle, then people, just to conserve their own household budget, will do something that, when everyone does it, will save the climate. Or through technological innovation, if clean energy is cheaper than dirty energy, then you don't have to appeal to anyone's self-sacrifice. Just in going for the cheapest option, they will save the planet.
But that works at a national level, but it doesn't work at an international level, does it? Because carbon pricing for individuals is not going to be something the whole world agrees on.
Indeed, you are right, unless it is an international regime, perhaps with some adjustments to level of economic development so that the countries catching up aren't penalized by the ones who've already gotten rich from emitting carbon. Although technological innovation does not require international agreement. That is, since a technology once invented can't be uninvented, then if there were abundant carbon-free energy, it'll be in everyone's interest to adopt it. It's just the cheapest way to get energy.
Doesn't it seem that a lot of the systems by which we live, whether it's capitalism or the global rules, are based really on the idea that it is not rational to think that you can uplift everybody?
Again, game theory tells us there can be positive-sum games, everybody wins, getting to yes, where if you change the structure of the environment, what gets rewarded, such as by inventing, say, clean, affordable energy technologies, then everyone can get ahead simultaneously. You're no longer in a situation where one person's sacrifice is another person's gain.
So how do we train ourselves to be better at this? I mean, what you talk about, and you quote some other people's work, is this question of, the quick mistake versus the long thought. That, it's very easy to look at some of these problems and jump to an answer, and it turns out to be the wrong one. Spend a little bit longer and you might get there. So how do we train ourselves not to make the quick mistake?
I think that there are a number of components. One of them is that our educational system should promote tools of rationality, probability theory, or logic. I think a little bit of game theory. These are all tools that are so widely applicable to understanding the world. We should see them as akin to reading and writing, that is, tools that are necessary to get the rest of your education. They should be part of our ordinary conversation, conventional wisdom, that we're all vulnerable to fallacies like arguing from anecdotes or misinterpreting chants. But perhaps most important, they should be written into our institutions, our schools and parliaments and court systems and journalism. They already are to some extent. That's one of the reasons why we have standards such as editing and fact-checking in journalism, so that the first idea that occurs to a reporter doesn't get printed. Why we have freedom of speech and open debate and the right to criticize in universities so that one person's folly can be pointed out by someone else or one person's honest mistake. While we have an adversarial system in the courts, it's institutions that make us collectively more rational than any of us could hope to be individually.
I mean, I suppose the rationalist has had to contend with two different types of opponent over time. One is the person of faith, the person who just believes things and doesn't care about reason. But there are also, more recently, what you're dealing with is people who also believe that they are rationalists. So how do you take on both of these sort of enemies, if you like?
Yes, and I'll deal with the second first. Sometimes I hear the criticism of rationality. Well, so-and-so said he was rational, and now we know that he was, full of baloney. And that can happen. Saying you're rational is not a giving grounds for your belief. It's a kind of irrationality to just claim it without being able to show it. And the power of rationality is it can always look on instances of itself, and it can always step back, take itself as a object of rational scrutiny, and point out flaws in how rationality is being applied at any given time. And indeed, it's nothing but rationality that allows us to say, well, that guy claims he's being rational, but he's wrong. Well, how do we know he's wrong? Because we're applying rationality to his failed attempts at rationality. And indeed, faith does go contrary to reason. Almost by definition, it's believing something without a good reason to believe. That's why we call it faith. And it's something that we all are tempted by in certain beliefs that are sacred to our identity, our tribe, our coalition, but that ought to be examined for all that. It may be that if you're on the left, there are some beliefs that you just have to be a member of the left in good standing, and you'll be ostracized and made fun of and canceled if you suggest them or if you doubt the orthodoxy, and so on the right. It is a secular equivalent of faith, and our left-wing and right-wing coalitions have become kind of quasi-religions, and that's a bad thing. It's better if we do have reasons for our beliefs.
Well, when it comes to faith, though, I mean, is it necessarily irrational to believe in God?
I'd say it is irrational in that there is no reason to believe in the existence of God, and that any difference that God would make to the world, we can take a look and we don't see that happening. Such as bad people being punished, such as miracles happening, such as the origin of the universe being only explicable by a divine creator.
But that's the big one, isn't it? Because when people say, well, if you can't explain how all this happened, there must be something else to it. Therefore, it's perfectly rational for me to believe in a higher power.
They're sometimes called the God of the gaps argument. And indeed, there could be things that happen that would persuade me that God exists. If there was someone announced that they were a messenger of God and made predictions about the future that came true, that performed miracles, that healed the sick without modern medicine, I'd be convinced, but that doesn't happen.
But that's why the stories of the miracles were so important, wasn't it? Because they were evidence.
They fall into a zone that I think it's a mode of thinking that we all have, and maybe faith is a good word for it. Things where we may not have evidence that it's true, but we psychologically don't feel we ought to need evidence that they're true. They're just things to believe because they're uplifting, inspiring, and it's just somehow uncouth or gauche to ask for reasons. And belief in God is one of them. The prominent new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens were often attacked not by people who said, well, you're wrong, here are 4 reasons a rational person should believe God exists, but rather it's just kind of not done to even put the question of God's existence on the table as a matter of something that is factually true or false. And indeed, psychologically, they're correct. There are beliefs that we hold not because there's evidence for them, but because we think they're sacred, it's empowering, it's uplifting, it's entertaining.
So were you always an atheist?
I think there's a period in my life where, if you ask me, I'd say, well, I guess I believe in God. Doesn't everyone? But I think as soon as I started to think things through and I had a definite opinion, then I was a skeptic, yeah.
So on the other side, the people who also say that they are rational, isn't the big problem now fake facts?
It is a problem now, and it's always been a problem. I think social media make it easier to proliferate fake news. But we've had them in supermarket tabloids. We've had them in urban legends. What are the stories from scripture, but a kind of original fake news? Rumors, conspiracy theories have always been with us. It's salient now because we have means of doing better. We have fact-checked journalism. We have historical archives. Even there, all of those are fallible too. And with social media making it so much easier to proliferate fake news, they've play a larger role in our awareness.
Well, is fake news a bigger thing now than before? I mean, I get that it's always been there in some form, but I suppose the question underlining all of this conversation is it getting worse?
One of the fallacies that I often have to point out is the fact that something bad is happening now does not imply that it's getting worse. This is a fallacy that I've had to deal with in two of my previous books, one on the decline of violence, The Better Angels of Our Nature, the other one on progress, Enlightenment Now, where people say, well, how can you say that war has declined? There's a war raging in Syria. Well, there is a war raging in Syria, but 30 years ago, there were wars raging all over the world as bad as Syria. Similarly, the fact that there's fake news now, that there are conspiracy theories, that there's medical quackery, does not by itself imply that it's gotten worse. It just implies there's a lot of it and we notice it a lot. Has it gotten worse? Conspiracy theories, as best we can tell from people who try to look with a constant yardstick, probably have not gotten worse, that their conspiracy theories, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the protocols of the Elders of Zion have been a constant through human history. Certainly fake news has. Fake news probably has a trifling effect on actual elections because most of it goes to people who are already partisans, and it doesn't change their mind. It really more titillates them more than persuades them. Certainly medical quackery goes way back. It's been actually the rule rather than the exception for most of human existence, including in medicine itself until relatively recently. There's an awful lot of false belief simply because until recently we haven't had the scientific and the historical tools to verify all our beliefs.
But so how do we verify on a practical basis when somebody sits there in the pub saying, no, but haven't you seen, this research that says that the vaccine gives you a third leg and four eyes?
Right.
I read it and I've seen it for myself, and you've got to read this stuff because it's real, and the media don't tell you about it because they're in on the conspiracy. But, if you go and look at this paper yourself, how are you supposed to approach that in a rational way?
Yeah, I think it depends on the believer. But you can, as well as finding common ground, things that everyone agrees, and seeing what follows and doesn't follow from them. You could question the veracity of their sources. Have they been right in the past? How do they arrive at their conclusions? Which also, by the way, puts the onus on more respectable institutions, such as newspapers and government agencies and scientific bodies, to show their work, to be more forthcoming on why they believe what they believe, in order to have a weapon against the other side that also claims authority. It shouldn't be a matter of authority when it comes to the ones that we really do and ought to trust. Part of it may just also be appealing to the fact that we do tend to follow respected figures in our sphere, and to get people who the believers might otherwise revere or be sympathetic to, and have them make statements that disavow the crazy beliefs. In this case of climate change, for example, where very few of us know enough atmospheric chemistry to actually retrace the evidentiary trail, we kind of trust the people with the white coats who claim that it's happening. We have good reason to trust them, and the people who don't believe in man-made climate change just don't trust that particular priesthood. But they shouldn't be a priesthood. It shouldn't be my experts versus your experts. It should be that my experts can actually show their work, and here are the reasons why they're advocating what they're advocating.
Yeah, because if you take the anti-vax movement right now on COVID, I mean, they've got their priests as well, and men in white coats who say, yes, I worked in the medical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, and, I've got 30 years of experience, and I'm telling you, this is dangerous.
Indeed. And so there may be a combination of tactics. Some of them might require recruiting champions or advocates who already have the sympathy of those parts of the population. In the case of climate change, for example, it's a tremendous mistake to have nothing but left-wing politicians arguing that we have to do something about climate change, because then the right wing will just turn them off and say, well, that's your tribe. Why should I believe you? What we need are libertarian and right-wing figures to make that case. Likewise, in the case of vaccines, it can't just be that this is what the experts say. It's that, well, we actually did the study. We've taken seriously the possibility of their side effects, and we haven't found any. And here's the study that shows it.
Yes, I mean, I started off talking about values and whether we needed to have shared values. I mean, it's one of the mistakes that we make these days is try and work out, a lot of books and arguments these days are framed with how to argue with a racist, how to argue with a climate skeptic or a climate denier. That if you start from a position of this is the right answer, you can't follow a rational line.
Indeed. I mean, that in fact, is the antithesis of rationality. Rationality is you start from shared premises or beliefs and show what follows from them.
How big a problem then is popular culture? Now, we've all grown up hearing, well, go with your gut, go with your instinct. Is that, in fact, the worst advice you can ever give anybody?
I think it's bad advice, yeah. Some cases we have no choice, but in general, it's better to think twice. To reflect on which of your beliefs might be false, to be open to evidence that they might be false, to change your mind when the evidence changes.
So do you have gut instincts as you go about your life? Yes.
Who doesn't?
And do you have to stop yourself from following them?
I do, and I'm probably not as successful as I ought to be because we're all subject to the bias. Namely, each of us thinks that the other guy is biased, but that we're not. But that's one of the reasons why it's so essential to be part of communities of rationality. That is, it isn't up to a single person to peer into his or her own soul and confess to your own sins of irrationality. None of us is capable of doing that. The question is, can we belong to groups where if we say something that is wrong, someone else has the right to criticize us for it? That's why we have free speech. That's why we have a free press. That's why I have an adversarial process in the courtroom. Not because any juror, any scientist, any professor, any pundit, any journalist is wise enough or rational enough to come up with the truth on their own, but rather knowing that anything they say may be criticized, anticipating the possible criticisms, defending them as best they can, other people can spot it. Community as a whole can be more rational than any of its individual members.
So we all have to work together in order to get to the right.
We do. We have to
right
kind of surrender some of our own claim to infallibility. My own little version as an academic, as a scientist, I subject myself to peer review. I hate it. It's annoying. I often think the reviewers themselves are full of baloney, but I submit to it knowing that I can't trust my own judgment.
Just to come back to this question of instinct and gut instincts. So every time, because we've all heard countless numbers of sort of anecdotes of people saying, well, I know the logical thing was to do this, but I just thought, I felt something different and I went with it and it worked and it was great. What do you think when you hear those stories?
Well, you wonder if they also remember all the times that they went with a gut and it didn't work out so well. That is this itself a case of confirmation bias where we remember the successes and forget all the failures?
So, and in practical terms, have you lived your life according to this?
Well, it
standard
may not be for me to judge because I, almost by definition of many of these biases, I'd be blind to them. I've tried my hardest. I mean, I think I've done okay in life. I'd like to attribute at least some of them satisfaction and success to avoiding certain foolish choices that I could have made.
So how did you come to this? How did Steven Pinker become Steven Pinker?
Part of it was beyond my control. I inherited the genes that I inherited. I developed in the way that I developed biologically. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a middle-class community in a liberal democracy. So I had that
in Canada,
in Montreal. So I had that unearned advantage. I went to decent schools, had access to encyclopedias and books. So I had all of those advantages. I then chose as a thing to study and a thing to do for a living, social science with its credo, not always observed that we ought to test our beliefs against the best possible evidence. in an academic arena that, at least when it functions well, which it doesn't always, means that you are called on to defend your assertions, that you may be criticized, and that's okay, and you may be attacked, and that's okay, but in turn you have the burden to defend your ideas.
So, I mean, you said this needs to be taught in schools. I mean, practically, how do you think that could be done?
Well, it's a good question, because we know, and to my disappointment, that simply having people sit through a critical thinking course doesn't do a whole lot to their critical thinking. On the other hand, if we're honest, we'll believe that we'll acknowledge that exposing people to courses in anything doesn't leave much lasting knowledge.
Because that's partly why you wrote this book, isn't it?
It is partly why I wrote the book, indeed.
Just explain what that...
So partly it's a matter of how you teach. You have to have active learning. That is, people can't just be taking notes from a lecture. They can't just be highlighting something in a textbook with a yellow marker, but they have to actively solve problems. They have to recast it in their own terms. Students have to be encouraged to generalize from the example they were taught on to dissimilar examples. So, for example, if you know that the availability bias, which is the bias to estimate probability and risk by how quickly you can remember examples. So you read about a plane crash and you think that plane travel is dangerous. Car crashes tend not to be covered by the news. People are unaware of the fact that it's much more dangerous to take the same trip by car. So that's an example of the availability bias. And you teach it to students and they can get the answer right in the exam. Then when it comes to, say, some other example, like how dangerous is terrorism, then it kind of goes out the window. It's, terrorists, or rampage shooters. The ability to take a lesson from one example and extend it to other examples doesn't always come naturally, and a good course in critical thinking has to have that as one of its goals. So there are just the naming the fallacies and being aware of them, but they're also recasting some of these tools of thinking into more mind-friendly terms. An example being, sounds kind of scary, of applying Bayes' rule, the formula devised by Thomas Bayes in the 18th century for how we should calibrate our belief in hypothesis according to the strength of evidence. That is, you get a medical test, you know that there are some false positives. What are the chances that you have the disease? People are pretty poor at it. Even doctors are rather poor because they often forget the prevalence in the population. And so if there is a rare disease, if there is a test that's less than perfect, then a lot of the positives are going to be false positives just because so many more people are healthy than sick. It's kind of hard to apply Bayes' rule and actually plug numbers into a formula. On the other hand, if you recast it and you say there are 1,000 people, 10 of them have the disease. Of the 10 who have the disease, 9 of them will test positive. Of the 990 who don't have the disease, 89 will test positive. And you put it concretely, or better still, you have a diagram where each square is a person, they're shown in different colors, then a lot of these things can be made intuitive. And I think as educators, as teachers, as journalists, we have a responsibility to try to present important concepts in rationality in an intuitive way.
To take the journalist's example, do you think we should move away from conflict? The basic tool of TV.
Oh, conflict?
Yeah, which is to have an argument, to have a debate.
Oh, I see.
One person on one side, one person on the other.
No, I think debate is good as long as it is not framed as a sport where the idea is who won, who lost. Debate in the sense of exploring hypotheses and trying to come to agreement as which is true and false is essential.
So are you presenting this ultimately because you're rather more hopeful than a lot of the people saying the world's going to hell?
Well, that has been a theme of two of my other books, not so much because of an attitude toward optimism, which itself is not particularly rational, but rather a call to base our beliefs on evidence and to extricate them from having our heads turned by vivid, gory anecdotes and examples, that being the availability fallacy. Have deaths in war increased or decreased? That shouldn't be a matter of whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, because regardless of whether you have a sunny disposition or not, what happens in the world happens. It should be a matter of getting the best data and looking to see which way the curve goes. Does it go up or down? Which you tend not to see in journalism because it is so event-driven. So if a war is going on, there'll be images of the war. If there are countries at peace and more of them than there used to be, that's not a fact that you can typically get from the news.
So if you could change the world, I suppose the answer is you just make everybody rational.
Well, indeed. I mean, although that sounds like waving a magic wand, and we're creatures, we're a species that is rational in some ways, tends not to be irrational in other ways. So it does depend on our institutions. It's not that a question of self-improvement. I mean, it's partly that, but that wouldn't be enough. Asking everyone, well, you should be more rational, and having an educational system that tries to make individuals more rational is a start, but ultimately it depends on our institutions, because none of us can ever be angels. None of us is ever going to be infallible or omniscient or infinitely wise. Together, if we can each point out each other's fallacies, we have more of a hope. And if we base our understanding on the best facts available. So I think if I were to pinpoint one thing, because I've been speaking very generically, of course we should all be more rational, but that's a bit of a cop-out to your question. But one of them would be that I'd say that if journalism were more oriented toward data, statistics, trends, and less toward incidents, so that since our view of the world, this is the availability bias, is driven by memorable events. Since journalism delivers memorable events, journalism, by having a non-random sample of what's happening in the world, has the capacity to seriously miseducate people. People to think that terrorism is a major threat to life and limb, whereas ordinary homicides, and to say nothing of car crashes and falls off ladders and drownings, are much greater threats. But more generally, to perhaps even take a leaf out of the pages of the sports section and the business section, where data are routinely presented. Sometimes when journalists say, well, we have to present stories because people won't put up with graphs and trends and numbers. And I say, well, look at your own sports section. People read the standings every day in the business section. I think presenting a crime, presenting a terrorist attack, presenting a climate policy ought to be done in the context of, has it been going up? Has it been going down? How prevalent is it? How does it compare to other risks? To give a more balanced understanding of the world, including an understanding of what has worked. One of the reasons that people are so cynical or even nihilistic about our democracy, our government, is they think it's a flaming dumpster. It's a disaster because all the failures are highlighted. The fact that there actually have been policies that have kind of more or less worked over the decades. Pollution controls really do drive pollution down, and the welfare state really does alleviate poverty. But you never read that, and so people feel that everything that government does is a failure and are open to radical, even nihilistic alternatives.
And finally, what do you say to those people who say, yeah, but it's a bit boring, isn't it? Where there would be no creativity, there would be no great art or great music or, great creation if everybody was just rational all the time.
Yeah, I know, and I do hear that all the time. The idea that if you're rational, you must be, dour and joyless and serious about everything. But there's nothing irrational about enjoying music or enjoying art or falling in love or loving your children or family or laughing over drinks. Those are our goals that we pursue because we're human. Rationality is a way of attaining goals, and there's nothing irrational about having those goals. Quite the contrary. If we have capacity for pleasure and fulfillment, then it's actually rational to pursue them, including having fun and partying, as long as you don't harm someone else.
Stephen Pinker, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
for sharing your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed that. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Nina Hodgson. Until next time, bye-bye.